pleasure to be together and have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with a basic and accessible definition of what ecopsychology is. Is there such a thing? Basic
I think
and
there
accessible?
is. I think there's a very simple definition, although it has been argued about a lot. But my simple definition is that it's the psychology of the human-nature relationship.
And what role does psychology play in that?
Well, of course, different people have different ideas about it, but mine is that there's a rich understanding in psychology about who we are and what we bring to that interface or to that relationship between ourselves and others. And vis-a-vis the environment, we should draw upon that understanding about our attitudes, our behaviors, our emotions, our denials, our what makes us reverent, what makes us motivated, how we perceive the outside world. So all of that has a lot of gems in it about our way of engaging. But in terms of ecopsychology, I first became involved with the field as it was developing because others were saying, how do we connect? How do we reconnect with the earth?
Because the premise is we're not connected.
We're not connected.
Right? That's where we're starting from here, is we've lost that connection in Western culture.
Yes.
Which then comes to your question, well, okay, how do we get it back? And that's where you entered the story?
That's where I entered the story, and I basically said, through the senses, that's how we connect. It's the only way we can connect.
That seems kind of obvious. What other options are there, really?
Well, it seems very obvious to me too, but people sort of sat up and said, oh, that's interesting, tell us more. So I did. And I developed a kind of, early on, a sort of 5-tiered notion of an ecological perception, or an ecological way of seeing. I don't even remember what the 5 parts are at this point, but it was about learning to see relationships, it was about becoming attentive, it was about facilitating seeing into the depth as opposed to being locked into a near point way of looking. So there were a number of things that I could easily say about how we could engage more. Reception was the very first step. We must become receptive rather than having this sort of busyness in our brains that keeps us from really receiving the sensory signals that are streaming in.
So put that into practical terms. If I'm really not aware of any of this, but I would like to be, I want to go out into nature. How does my busy brain work against me? And how does receptivity solve that?
So say that you've had a very full day and you're thinking about what happened in the office or what's happening at home, or you've got your to-do list ticking off. And so you walk down a trail and you don't see a thing about what's there. You might notice a big ponderosa, but you aren't going to notice any of the nuances. And we do that all the time. When I first started this work in ecological perception, I used to do little tricks like step off the trail when people were coming along and see if they noticed me. Over and over again, I could be 2 feet, 3 feet off the trail almost. Well, that's probably an exaggeration, but hardly off the trail, standing in the bushes, and they'd walk right by.
Not because they were just trying to respect your privacy, but you felt it was because they literally didn't see you.
They literally did not see me. There's something called inattentional blindness, and it's a real phenomenon. There was some kind of hilarious early empirical work around it. You probably know the gorilla study. That's an example of inattentional blindness.
Right.
So in that case, the subjects were asked to throw a basketball around a circle and count how many times they threw it. And so their attention was riveted on that. So this other person walks by with a gorilla suit on.
Very nearby.
Very nearby, and in the aftermath, the experimenter asks, did you notice anything unusual? And generally people did not. They did not see the gorilla. So that's referred to as inattentional blindness. So we can have our attention focused outwardly, or we can be very busy in our minds. So it can be focused internally. That's referred to as endogenous attention, and this is, of course, exogenous.
Yeah. And because the mind has the capacity to see and experience in kind of vivid detail fantasy, memories, or
all sorts of visualizations,
desires, and they become more real, you're saying, than what's right in front of us. They
can, if that's where the energy is, if that's where the attention is. And there's another piece about where the inner activity, the neurons firing off very quickly, you're busy in your brain, meets the incoming sensory signals. So in the middle of the brain, there's something called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and it's seen as the gateway, the attentional gate. So you've got this, you've got these projections coming down from the visual cortex that are, streaming signals down. And you've got these signals coming up from the retina and the optic nerve, and they meet at the LGN. And if there's a phase resonance between the signals, then a signal will get through and go up to cortex and be further processed.
And I'll see Laura standing off the trail.
Yeah, especially if you turn your head. But so one of the things that I'm concerned about when it comes to really perceiving the outer world and really meeting the natural world and all its signals with a kind of sincerity and a kind of respect is to quiet that noise, quiet the projections, and become aware. This is what I spoke about yesterday. Become aware of the ways in which we project and what triggers or amplifies that projective tendency. And there's some very clear cognitive research on it done by Daniel Kahneman. You may have heard of him.
I have, yeah.
So he's got this model of the brain where you've got system 1 and system 2. And system 1 is very quick to respond and doesn't really use its attentional capacity, doesn't reflect, needs very little information. It's observed by neural networks that are really highly facilitated, so they fire off quickly. You need a little tiny bit of energy and off goes the neural network.
And what's an example of system 1 thinking?
So an example that's used, I think, frequently is what happens when you meet someone, like coming to a conference and you meet someone briefly and within about 30 seconds you've sized that person up. You think you don't even need any more information. And system 1 has a troubling pattern, which is that it's trying to come to a conclusion and be cognitively comfortable or at ease. So Kahneman says that cognitive ease drives system 1. Just wants to feel a sense of coherence. And that coherence, I don't know if he'd say this because he's not a neuroscientist, but the coherence in my mind is really a familiar neural network firing off in response to something that's familiar. Kahneman's term is to say when you recognize something familiar, or when you project something familiar and it fits well enough with what's in front of you, it feels easy. It's easy to see. The neural network is already primed, and you
Probably
call it
feels
good.
safe.
Yeah, you come to a conclusion. the trickiness about System 1 is that when you come to a conclusion, you feel that cognitive ease or coherence. You also feel that it's right. It's truth. And System 1 does not differentiate between that coherence or comfort and truth.
Well, so this is where the bumper sticker comes into play.
Which is?
Don't believe everything you think.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. Because often it comes to these irrational conclusions. It's often wrong. I mean, it makes mistakes. There are a lot of perceptual illusions that come out of this fast response. And another problem with System 1 is that you're convinced, if you're really like, oh, that feels right, you're convinced you don't need any more information. And this is what I'm concerned about in a sociocultural sense.
Right. That's all you need to know. Move on.
Yeah.
I've made my conclusions.
Yeah.
All right, so I have a host of questions about that. But let's pick up System 2 so we can have something to compare. How's that work?
So System 2 operates much more slowly. It takes cognitive energy, like attention. It is inquisitive. It asks questions like, what's that? In my thinking again, there's the time or the opportunity for the incoming signals to penetrate a little bit further into these secondary neural nets. I don't know if this is true, but it makes sense to me given what I know about how the visual system works. So that there's more association, there are more associations that are activated. There's more possibilities, which makes for wonder and awe, which makes, I mean, that's the state when you're asking, you're saying, wow, what is that? So it's not always a wondrous state, but you can get there with System 2. With System 1, you're just wanting to get it right.
So it sounds to me like System 1 is where we habitually spend our time.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So Kahneman will say clearly that that's the default response system. And
so what does it take to integrate System 2 then? What do you need?
Well, it takes intention. It takes, I mean, you could, if you're feeling good and you're not in a hurry and something pops up and you go, wow, what's that? There you are doing reflective thinking as opposed to jumping to a conclusion. And that maybe required no intention, but it does require attention. What I'm suggesting in the talk yesterday was that we become more intentional about pausing and not jump to the conclusion, because so often it becomes a matter of slapping our expectations onto the world. And that doesn't allow us to pick up the signals that may be providing some adaptive information, like climate change signals. I mean, they're all around me in my neighborhood. If I was a climate dismissive or denier, I probably would say, oh, that was just the last storm that hit the beach. That isn't the progression of slow sea level rise picking up speed. So that's part of my concern, is that we pick up what is real now, that is what Rafe Sagrin, did you ever know Rafe?
No.
He had this notion of, what did he call it? No analog ecology. Like these emergent ecologies because of such rapid change on the planet now. So we might expect that we see a community, say a plant community, operating in this way, or the relationships occurring in a certain way. But because things are changing really quickly, there might be surprises there. When you're surprised, you know you're not projecting. But if you arrive and say, oh, got it, you know, put down a data point and that's it, and off you go.
Yeah.
And so the lack of inquiry becomes, in my mind, problematic as things are changing. And one more point about that. System 1 becomes very easily convinced of its rightness under a number of conditions. And one is if a message or if something is repeated. So if you hear the same thing over and over again, that becomes a kind of reality.
So you mean like the entire public relations industry repeating things over and over and over?
Especially sound bites.
System 1 likes that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm giving you the negative side of all this, the positive side, and then I'll stop.
Yeah. Oh, please don't stop.
The positive side is that System 1 is really operating from what psychologists, perceptual psychologists, call perceptual set or schemata. It's a facilitated network that, as I mentioned earlier, fires off really quickly because the synaptic connections are strong. And they're strong because you've paid attention and you've had repeated exposure. So you've got something that subserves the perception of a carrot, you know, or of, you know, something familiar, an osprey.
Well, and let's take a little sidebar here because that serves us pretty well.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
I don't need to have to examine a carrot and decide what it is every single time, right? I can just see it, there it is.
Exactly. And so there are great advantages to it. It's not all bad. What it depends upon, in my view, so I'm kind of an advocate here, what it depends upon is whether or not you've chosen to attend to something that feeds that readiness to see. So if you spend your time watching a flat screen with a video game, you pick up the kinds of things that are happening there quickly. If you instead spend your time looking at reptiles or birds, you're going to be able to pick those up quickly and distinguish all the warblers after a lot of practice. And you can pick them up as they flit by. I mean, you and I have both seen that.
Oh yeah, I spent some time with some anthropologists and would go out on the trail with these people. And I was seeing rocks and pebbles, and every other step they saw a flake because they were conditioned to do so.
Yes, exactly. That's a great example of perceptual set. And it works really, really well. So the question really is, what are we feeding our brains with? What are we paying attention to? What signals are we absorbing to feed the structure, the neural networking in our mind so that we respond with comfort and clarity and quickly to the things in the world that we value. So natural history is an incredible training ground for that. I mean, if we want to develop ecological ways of seeing, and if we want to develop an ecological sensibility, a relational sensibility, then looking at plant communities or looking at the behavior between the birds and the chipmunks, you know, any of these relational encounters are feeding a sensibility that is part of where I believe we need to go.
Well, and okay, feeding a sensibility sounds, what's the word I'm searching for? It sounds like that's a soft way to look at it. But you're suggesting that you're also doing something very tangible in your brain.
Neuroplasticity.
You're rewiring neural networks
Yeah.
to find familiarity in something that wasn't previously familiar.
Exactly.
Which brings me to the question of, you're talking about choice.
Yes.
This is not something that just happens to us necessarily.
Yes.
We get to choose.
Yep.
Is that part of the power of ecopsychology, is training people to see that they have a choice?
That's a good idea. I mean, I've been doing that in this visual realm. I've been encouraging students and others for a number of years to be intentional about where they place their attention. Because early on, I was fortunate enough to be exposed in grad school to the very early work on visual system neuroplasticity. And it was all very exciting news. And for me, I kept hearing it as perceptual potential. And I just wanted more of it. So I have been thinking about what it is that we want to see more of for a long time. And when you put that into the context of ecopsychology, where the issues are very much about degraded ecologies and our environmental behavior, it would make sense that we would want to put a lot more attention on learning about the relational world and responding to it accurately, as opposed to more objectification. I mean, the Western eye, the modern Western eye, is trained on an object orientation. We want more things.
Sure,
and
everything's a commodity to us.
Yeah, I just learned that we are now, as consumers, 70% of the U.S. economy, because they've got us trained so well. Very savvy psychological tools have, done their work. So this is kind of anti-consumerist, anti-dualistic ways of training people to be in the world.
Well, some of the language you use is hauntingly familiar if you have looked at all at mindfulness.
Yes.
As a practice, a very ancient practice with many different traditions to draw from. How do you deal with that as a scientist? And you're restricted in so many ways by the culture of objectivity. How do you introduce ideas like mindfulness and attentiveness into the conversation in a way that can be accepted? Yeah,
that's a good question. One way was that I left the hardcore academic institutions. Not entirely, but I did enough so that there was more latitude for talking about these kinds of issues in behavioral and relevant terms, because I think mindfulness is really important. What I've been talking about in terms of paying attention, and I never really liked that phrase, paying attention, although it is energetically demanding in a cognitive sense, is a practice of mindfulness. Just like there are many modes of practicing or cultivating mindfulness, there are with attention too. So the Buddhist had 10 levels of cultivating attention, and it was all part of mindfulness practices. There was choice about how to pay attention. So the skills of attention that I would like all of us to be gaining or cultivating are the ability to focus where we choose, rather than being distracted easily. The ability to be flexible in our focus so that we can move it in and out of the distance easily, so that we can be very focused when we're reading when we're focusing on another, and open it up wide when we're tracking or playing basketball or wandering in the woods and wanting to pick up the whole wide scene. So that flexibility of focus is one. And another one is being able to sustain our attention, to hold it where it is.
Mm-hmm.
And these are really basic skills for the Buddhist traditions that emphasized real practice in mindfulness. So I use it pretty interchangeably, but I suppose someone would want to parse it out more.
Here's the big question for average people. Most people don't know from neural pathways. You know, a lot of this language would go right by them. Just because they haven't been exposed. Why does it matter? Why does any of this matter to the course of ordinary life among people who are just paying the mortgage, getting their kids through school?
Well, that's a big question. It matters because our ecological systems, our support systems are falling apart. And we hear about it every day if we're paying attention to that. And there are some that believe we're looking at a collapse in another 15, 20 years. And already there are plenty of signs. I don't need to go into like the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment Report, but that was damning. And the report that came out about the loss of biodiversity 6 months ago, it's damning. And so if we don't change our collective behavior, we will continue on a very destructive path. And from an ecopsychological point of view, the root of that destruction is that we operate in very dualistic terms, meaning we, humans, are separate from nature. We're above nature. We can dominate, we can control. We don't need to think about tearing up that salt marsh or cutting down that forest and the loss of the carbon that occurs as a result. We're used to doing what we want. I mean, I was thinking about highest and best use yesterday. That phrase is rather horrific. That the highest and best use of a piece of land is to develop it, even if it's with a cinder block building that serves as a storage shed. That's the highest, and that's one of the highest and best uses. The others would be a house, a drugstore, a Walmart, all better than leaving it as a forest. So from an ecopsychological point of view, that stems from this divide where we don't see ourselves as part of, where we don't recognize the interdependence that keeps all of us going in this reciprocal manner. And that dualistic lens has been long conditioned by our early philosophers, by our settlement as an agrarian species, by some people say that the witch burnings were part of this kind of trajectory towards a really dualistic, objectifying, individualistic lens, because they were the pagans, they were the nature lovers, and they were...
System 1 tells you that's all you need to know.
Yeah, they were troublemakers for the church. They were troublemakers for anyone that was tithing. So...
All right, well, so...
Yeah, that was a long answer to
Look, well, it's a complicated conversation and a complex question. So you've articulated that the stakes are high, couldn't really be higher. The timeline is short. But what you're talking about is a radical revision of how human beings think.
Mm-hmm. I was talking about recognition yesterday, and even Kahneman will say, it's hard to do. We can do it, but it's hard.
Well, so that's the question. My first question was, can we do that?
Yeah.
But the second is, how? Where do we start? Clearly, that's probably a very complicated answer also, but where can we start? How do we do this?
I think it's a very simple answer.
Oh, good.
We spend a lot of time looking here. Mm-hmm. And this is a very narrow visual field if we're looking at a screen on our phone. Mm-hmm. So it's narrow, it's tightly focused, it's at 18 to 24 inches, maybe, something like that. Or we're looking at a computer screen that is a little bit bigger for hours and hours, conditioning this narrow focus. Mm-hmm. And it is all human artifact, wherever any of those screens. It's also two-dimensional. The sensory body has no opportunity to engage. There's no sense of being in depth. Mm-hmm. There's no sense of participating. The sensory body is probably starved after a while. And as a result, we go back to the screen because that's what becomes more comfortable. That's what becomes more familiar. Mm-hmm. It's a sad story. So in terms of where to begin, I say look up, look out, look beyond ourselves. Do natural history.
Even if it's in your own backyard.
Even if it's in your own backyard, we need to look beyond ourselves, beyond the human artifact, beyond the two-dimensional screen, beyond the narrow focus. Mm-hmm. It's really important.
Well, as a first step, that's huge.
Yeah. I mean, it's asking for probably more than we will do. Well, some of us will.
Some will, and some come to that themselves. They
Yeah.
come to this sense of
Yeah.
alienation and isolation and
Yeah.
and feeling thin for having spent so much time online.
And being really hungry for a change and
Yeah.
being motivated to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And that is good news because that's where the choice is so, we're so cognizant of it. Mm-hmm. It's really intentional. I, of course, worry most about the children in this respect.
Mm-hmm. Well, because they're not receiving a chance to ever learn an alternative.
Right.
Many of them.
Yeah, many of them aren't. And as Peter Kahn pointed out the other day, the baseline for the richness of the natural order is shifting. So we've lost so many places to play in the woods. I mean, I grew up mucking around in a swamp and playing on a beach and never ever saw any garbage. Mm-hmm. Thousands of frogs in the spring, and tadpoles and frogs. And that's not so readily available.
No, it's not.
So there's this shifting baseline of experience around what is nature and what might grab your attention and what might be interesting and wondrous. And so it's easier to replace that with a very dynamic, seductive screen and a game and a...
Well, it's the story of ourselves. Mm-hmm. We're looking in the mirror when we do that.
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
Final question, bringing the conversation back to the idea of natural history. And Tom Fleischner's definition of natural history that he shares so beautifully of being the process of falling in love.
Yeah.
What role does that play in your mind in getting people to look away from the screen?
I think Tom is right on about the need to appeal to the emotional aspects of doing natural history. I also know that it's true. Haven't we all fallen in love with the natural world?
Yes.
I mean, we go outside and it can change your moment in a heartbeat because of the beauty and because it feels good. And what was that definition of love, that you love the other that makes you feel good? You love the other that allows you to love yourself. When we're outdoors and feeling good, it's a lot easier to love ourselves, because there's so much, I'm not being very articulate here, but there's just so much opportunity to feel yourself as participating in something larger.
Well, the word that comes to my mind is reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
There's so much give and take in that relationship.
Yeah. And beauty plays a big, big role. There's a lot to be said about beauty. And part of my notion about what we refer to as beauty is that which has wholeness and wholesomeness and is, a beautiful pattern fit together. Something that is not broken and not adulterated, and it's got integrity. And that's
which you find in the natural world.
Yeah, that's what you see when you step outside, if you're not in a degraded environment. So here again is the importance of the healing back or giving back in terms of reciprocal.
If you're not in a degraded environment, and if you're not stuck in system one thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Those two things together,
yes,
you have a good shot.
Yeah.
Well, that conversation about beauty we'll have to set that aside, because it would be a conversation all its own. But thank you for taking the time to share your ideas and talk about this with me. I appreciate it.
It's really fun. Yeah, I'd like to talk for all day.
We could do that, couldn't we?
We could. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right.